Hi, I'm Boris Sofman, co-founder and CEO of Bedrock Robotics, and I have the pleasure here of having a conversation with Phil Inagaki, who is one of our key investors at Bedrock from Xora. Phil, would love for you to introduce yourself. You have a very special background where you felt the turmoils of being a founder and the ups and downs of the startup life in a way that most investors haven't.
Sure. Well, I'll be really quick, but basically right out of undergrad, I founded a company developing semiconductor materials. They could be applied in displays, photovoltaic sensors, ran it for 11 years. We sold it, did a few other startups, but spent my first 15 years as a startup founder and operator. And then I moved into venture capital 6 years ago, first with a fund closely associated with MIT called The Engine, and then starting 4 years ago with Xora.
Yeah, awesome. And yeah, Xora's got a really interesting kind of history, being very closely associated with Temasek and really, really impressive sovereign wealth fund of Singapore, which is an interesting global lens that we'll touch on a bit later. So Phil, you have a special lens on deep tech, with semiconductors being as deep as it gets in some of these industries. So when we met a while back, and I think we got introduced, I think it was late last year even. Tell us about how you thought about Bedrock and this industry of automating specialized heavy machinery and construction.
Well, maybe I'll start with a little story about how I came to be so excited about Bedrock. I'll go a little ways back, which is I was very lucky to test drive a Tesla right before the Model S really started ramping. And I remember when I drove that car, it was just a visceral experience. In fact, nothing brilliant, but I came home and just bought Tesla stock right away. It was such an impact driving that car. And then when I took a Waymo for the first time, it was, a very similar experience. I couldn't believe what I was experiencing. I haven't told you this before, but I was actually a self-driving car skeptic for quite some time when it was really hot investment areas for VCs early on. I was thinking this is going to be really hard. It's going to take a long time. And then when I took a Waymo, I realized, wow, this is here. It's actually ready for prime time. And so, I remember we were talking about it at Xora, and we were starting to think, where else will autonomy have a large impact? To be honest, we weren't looking at construction. We were thinking more about factories. But then it's really meeting you and learning about what you were doing in the construction sector that got us very excited. It just felt like a right time in technology inflection was meeting a very urgent and pressing pain point in the construction industry.
And you're not wrong. The whole AV journey took a lot longer than people thought. I remember when Waymo kicked off in 2009, talking to a few folks in that original group, there was a thought that we'll solve it in 3-4 years max. And it's it'll be, and we'll have things on the road and then we'll scale it and it's going to be fantastic. And it was a long journey. It took a while. And 15 years later, it's this incredible hockey stick that it's clearly working, and it's over 100 million miles, fully driverless. It's, adding millions of miles a week. So it's exponential growth, and it's 5 times safer than a human. But it was definitely this long journey before 2021 was the beginning of the actual hockey stick that really started to work. So you weren't wrong, but when it happened, it's been incredible and just feels like it's the future.
My first company was in the field of semiconductor materials, and I remember all these experienced entrepreneurs and technologists saying the introduction of a new material in the semiconductor industry takes 10 years. And of course, I was thinking, no, it'll be shorter, but it takes 10 years. And so what is different for you doing your second startup as a founder and CEO, and what did you learn at Waymo, which you're applying at Bedrock?
Yeah. So before Waymo, I had a consumer hardware company, consumer robotics, doing high-end entertainment products. And I'll tell you, one of the big learnings is to really appreciate the importance of the sector you're in and the business model that you're driving, because no matter how good your execution might be, there's a physics to each business that massively impacts how easy or hard success might be, and also the margin of error that you might have along the way with whatever surprises you have. And there's a complementary learning at Waymo where the sheer scale of transportation afforded Waymo the cover to develop this technology and start to scale it. And even at the earliest stages of commercialization, there was such a perceived value on the company because of how big of a market they were moving into. And I still remember, like, in a lot of our conversations with, with investors and with press, we never framed it as, ride hailing in Phoenix suburbs or even the ride hailing market or trucks. It was always like 3 trillion miles of driving per year in the US. And that really like stuck with me because I saw how much like momentum and tailwind that provided. And it also changes the lens and how you develop the technology because you're already thinking about this in a massive kind of scalable way. And the conversation was always about the driver, not the car or the truck or or anything else. But at the same time, even like Waymo, the technology really started to work, but there was a lot of complexity even at Alphabet and Waymo scale in shipping and scaling these sort of technologies, because you're solving these problems that are so astronomical where you have to solve everything that San Francisco throws at you if you want to ship a robotaxi in SF. The long tail safety case is part of your exposure in every single ride. There's no way to slice it up. There's no way to simplify it. If you want to sell a product that's meaningful, you have to, be able to solve that long tail. And then when you're scaling it, you have the complexity of developing your own vehicles and operations and everything. And so that was one of the lenses where we deeply appreciated how powerful these new generations of technologies were, where you can go from these engineered solutions to letting data and the machine learning around it explain how you solve these problems, but allow it to solve incredibly hard problems and generalize across cities and across platforms in this unique way. We saw this opportunity to apply it to specialized heavy machinery, starting with construction, but we also tried to intentionally bypass some of the things that made Waymo so expensive and so complicated to get to market and be able to ship faster. And so I'd say Bedrock in a lot of ways is a combination of learnings of both the tailwinds and headwinds of all of these experiences. But at the end of the day, like the timing really matters. And there's this like really special point in time right now where this technology's unlocked this ability to solve problems that we never could have solved even, 6, 7, 8 years ago.
Yeah. I think, not to embarrass you, but when I first met you, one of the things that really struck me is how thoughtful and humble you have been about launching Bedrock while being confident. And I think it's those learnings that inform that, right? And the approach you are taking, we believe, will allow you to scale the company very quickly. So one of the things which really struck us in terms of technology inflection is not only this moment in autonomy and AI accelerating edge computing, but also what is particular to construction is that all these machines have come to be drive-by-wire, is a term you taught me. So they're really ready for autonomy. And you can just very quickly retrofit these machines and then have them out in the field. Can you talk a little bit about how quickly and how inexpensively you're able to automate these machines and how it's different than how you went about with cars at Waymo?
Yeah, this is one of the most exciting aspects that we discovered, really thinking about the space, where at Waymo, whether you're doing cars or trucks, you're putting something on public roads, none of these vehicles were ready to become driverless. And so every single time we would do this, we'd have to have a vehicle program, which was extraordinarily expensive and took many, many years, oftentimes 4 or more years, where we would partner with Chrysler, with Jaguar, with Daimler Trucks, and there's more and more that have happened. And you had to go through that before you could actually ship a driverless vehicle. It was because they weren't fully kind of electrified. They needed redundancy on brakes and steering and actuation. You had to integrate in a special way. And so not only do you have this really expensive and time-consuming development path, But then when you're actually selling the final product, and let's say you're selling a truck to, customers like, JB Hunt, through Daimler and whoever the customer might be, even if they're buying a ready-made truck from Daimler, you're having to sell into this sales cycle where they're paying, hundreds of thousands of dollars for these machines, and now they're not going to like artificially throw them out. And so now you have to like kind of phase in and convince them to buy another machine. In construction, we're right now using Caterpillar machines, and they're so incredibly designed where they've basically electrified the entire platform. So it's electric to hydraulic. And so what that means is every signal in the machine is an electric signal. Everything from the controls going into the hydraulics to actually control the, the arms and the body, to the pressure gauges, the IMUs and the encoders built into the machine, the seatbelt sensor, everything. So you basically have this fully electric state on every machine since about 2018, which is designed in this like really wonderful way, by Caterpillar, frankly, to enable these sort of technological innovations. And what that means is that we can retrofit these machines with sensors and compute suites and have a computer suck in the data from our sensors as well as the machine itself, and use that to both train off of like data we're collecting and then directly command the machine where the machine thinks is being controlled by a joystick, but it's just an electrical signal coming from somewhere else. And what that means is that now these machines that are oftentimes $400,000, $500,000, oftentimes closer to $1 million, they can be retrofit for a fraction of that cost and immediately be autonomy capable. And so a fleet doesn't have to completely reinvent its fleet. It's like quite amazing. And we can do this in less than 3 hours at this point, from start to finish.
So, that is very attractive. But in addition, if you compare this sector to Waymo, there's also the fact that you don't have to own fleets, right? Can you talk a little bit how you work with general contractors?
This is one of our favorite aspects of this model. We become a technology provider to the whole industry. We're not here to manufacture machines. We're not here to become a general contractor. Our customers end up being the general contractors and subcontractors that already buy and operate these types of machines. And so, for example, Sun Construction, one of our first and one of our closest partners, they self-perform earthwork across heavy civil projects, industrial projects, municipal plants, and so we would sell to them and upfit their machines, and then our core product becomes the Bedrock Operator, which is the labor and then the services around it. And so their machines become autonomously capable. They can work 5 hours a day, 15 hours a day, 24 hours a day. They become very predictable in the quality of work that they do. They're superhuman in their level of safety. There's all these analytics and data tools that help you estimate projects and understand the progress of the work. And we become a technology provider while the existing industry that's used to operating and managing these machines and doing this work can do so with a lot less constraints and way more productivity. And in a world that is so labor constrained and just cannot meet the needs that are just escalating, in every single one of these types of sectors, that's a pretty huge enabler. And in the meantime, we can do what we're good at and leave the industry to do what it's great at.
I mean, that's another thing which struck us as investors meeting you and talking about Bedrock is that operator market globally is measured in hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue, right? You don't need to tap into the machine market. It's already a huge opportunity, and one where there's a huge pain point because there are increasingly labor shortages. Can you talk a little bit about what you've learned working with general contractors and anything that surprised you there? Because that is a new market for you, even though you have all this experience in autonomy, right?
Yeah, there was like a stereotype sometimes that you'd hear about the construction space to where it's like, oh, it's so hard to break into. It's like, it isn't picking up technology and it's just this like really kind of painful uphill battle. And we found the exact opposite. It's I've never seen such a pull for a product or technology in my career where the pain points are so real and there's so much demand that is left unmet that if you're able to solve it and it genuinely unblocks a general contractor or subcontractor in being more productive and have more flexibility and produce more work and do it more efficiently, the pull is just astronomical. And so you look at this in this industry, and you have skyrocketing construction demand from onshoring and manufacturing in the United States. So $250 billion of factories and manufacturing investment in manufacturing construction that needs to be done every single year now. $170 billion of data center construction every single year. Huge housing shortages, infrastructure shortages. And at the same time, you have this like labor pool that is plummeting, and over 40% of construction workers are retiring in the next 10 years. And so these just don't line up. And you have, when this happens, you have costs that skyrocket, you have work that doesn't get done. You just handcuff the whole economy, because construction is not this isolated space. It like underpins everything. You want to support the AI revolution. Well, too bad. You got to build everything, and you got to build data centers. You got to build energy facilities. You want to manufacture more in the United States. Well, you got to build chip fabs and so forth. And so it's been amazing to see. And so even today, there's well over 1.25 billion hours of construction labor just in the United States, and that's massively supply constrained. And when you look worldwide, it's 6-7x that, where globally, I think the whole construction industry is like 13-14% of global GDP. It's not too often you have a shot at trying to just meaningfully enable that scale of productivity in the world.
And that's, not to talk too much about data centers as an example, but if you think about the value of time to being online for a data center, it's huge, right? So as you're sizing the market, it's not even factoring a premium for accelerating construction, right? Which is hugely valuable.
This is a fun one where, you look at data centers, like every day you're up and running, a day earlier is millions of dollars of revenue oftentimes. And in general, anytime you have somebody that is building data centers, warehouses, factories, somebody's investing in this. And oftentimes it's a developer that took out a loan and they're paying 9% interest on a multi-$100 million loan. And so if you can compress that schedule by 1 month or 2 months, that oftentimes dwarfs any impact that you'll have on the actual even construction side. So it's kind of fascinating. And so it's one of those interesting industries where you can immediately see the value proposition and the labor shortages and the impact that can have. But there's these like secondary benefits and 5 or 6 dimensions across safety, schedule compression, predictability, forecasting projects, being able to leverage your resources more fully. And everybody benefits from something like this. It's kind of interesting. So we've studied this pretty deeply in the United States and are really excited about this thesis. You have this like really global view, and we've just started to scratch the surface in our conversations on how this can potentially be leveraged internationally. What's your thought when you look at this and you see the sort of trends that are happening in Asia or Middle East or elsewhere? Even our focus right now is the United States. It's very, very much a global pain point that potentially can have some relief. Curious to get your lens on this one.
Yeah, I think, speaking about Asia and maybe particularly East Asia, but I'll add Singapore onto that. Labor shortages are also a huge issue. In fact, those populations are aging even more quickly than in the US. So I think the opportunity is just as large there. In Singapore, also in the construction industry, a very large percentage of workers are coming from a migrant workforce, which has its own set of issues. So there is definitely an urgent need for Bedrock's technology in Singapore, and I'd say overall of East Asia, and I'm sure many other regions globally.
That's the exciting part, is that when you like fast forward, 3, 5, 10 years, what starts as an excavator doing heavy earthwork and accelerating industrial construction projects, you really quickly evolve to these fleets of machines across all types of use cases of not just excavators, but wheel loaders, bulldozers, motor graders, compactors, scrapers, and even in other industries where you get into quarries and mining and agriculture. And you have an opportunity to almost be this operating system to change the way we plan and execute these jobs. And it becomes almost like a digitized manufacturing process in the real world. And so you want to build something, you're as a general contractor, you're setting a goal for what you want to build. You're not micromanaging your wheel loaders. And that's where we try to imagine what that looks like, but we're probably completely underestimating how that can potentially play out, similar to how you see the digitization of how you fulfill a warehouse if you're Amazon, or how you manage data in a modern data center. These types of efficiencies end up having such exponential enablement on the whole industry. It'll be pretty exciting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, and that's another thing which struck us, that the construction industry has resisted digitization. A lot of people have tried to develop software solutions that help the construction industry, but as you introduce autonomy, you suddenly have this entry point to really create a digital environment, right? And to introduce more solutions, and as you're saying, an operating system. So, you're starting somewhere exciting, but where it can go is truly incredible, we believe.
Yeah, that's awesome. How do you tend to look at these types of investments where oftentimes the timing matters a ton, and there's a lot of companies that had exactly the right idea, but they were too early or sometimes too late, and that makes all the difference. And we've talked a little bit about this from a technology evolution standpoint, but just curious what you're seeing about the trends and just the readiness for AI and how this is propagating in industries that makes you optimistic about the timing and the potential impact of Bedrock.
I think, and you've mentioned this yourself, that there's industry pain, so there's a strong drive to adopt the technology. We've talked about how the different components of enabling tech are ready, from the machines themselves to autonomy to the compute. But I think there's also a bit of a psychological factor here around people now experiencing autonomy, just like I described my experience, and so being willing to believe, right? And I think you've talked about going to Waymo states and GCs actually being really ready to believe that now is the time to adopt this technology.
Yeah, we're obviously huge fans of Waymo, and absolutely loved our experience there. And we've taken more than a few partners inside of Waymo cars, and I think that's probably one of the biggest differences. Is we haven't had anybody doubt that this is now possible, because they're seeing it happen in these incredible ways in Arizona and Texas and California, and now in like a dozen other announced cities on the way. That sort of tailwind can really accelerate adoption of these sort of technologies.
I mean, you asked me, or you mentioned there's a lot of great ideas, but timing wasn't right. I think, and this goes back to earlier parts of our conversation, that in your case, the timing is right, but that's not by luck. It's by you really taking the sum of your experiences and deciding what opportunity to attack. We look at it a lot in the category of embodied AI, right, which is very hot right now. But the more we understand Bedrock, the more it seems like all the factors are lined up. People are trying to develop humanoid robots. It is probably going to be a lot harder and longer to have the hardware ready, but in your case, the hardware is ready. I mean, we come back to this point. So we feel a very strong conviction that in your case, the timing is right.
That's awesome. Yeah, and there's this huge difference in the physics of how LLMs have expanded, where you have almost infinite data and a common kind of core features around language that you can leverage. When you get into the physical world, you have hardware, you have sensors, you have very particular problems, you have more complicated chain where you have to think about the whole vertical path, and having the machines already present and enabled in the form that they'll take in the autonomous version is actually a pretty huge advantage. It accelerates the way we can collect data, it accelerates the path to market, it obviously helps in the physics of the business. So we're very excited about this as well.
And we haven't made this point explicitly, but the combination of the hardware being ready and the business model, the GCs owning the fleets, actually allows you to be very capital efficient in terms of how much money can get the business to true commercial state.
Yeah, and it's one of the really great gifts over what the challenge we had at Waymo is that we can go to market and actually have exceptional capabilities and skills and a subset of the capabilities that a human might be able to do. And there's projects where something like, heavy earthwork and loading dump trucks happens 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for most of a year. We're on that sort of a project. That actually ends up being incredibly enabling to then be able to start building a business while you pursue this holy grail of all the opportunities that are out there. And Phil, it's been wonderful to get to know you for a pretty long stretch through some mutual friends, and also just to see how we think about companies like this in a compatible manner. And we're just really excited to have Xora lead our recent funding round, where we raised an additional around $30 million, led by you guys. We brought in some really amazing additional partners. We're really excited to kick off this journey together with you.
Yeah. No, we're incredibly excited to be investors into Bedrock at Xora. Since first hearing about the company roughly a year ago, it's been incredible to watch you execute with relentless speed. It's very rare that people are meeting their milestones on time in such a complex space, and we are impressed by what you've achieved in a very short amount of time, and really much look forward to being part of your journey going forward.
Thanks, Phil. Exciting times ahead.